Close that for the minute. Can you all see that and you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Let's get going then. So, yeah, absolutely. This is Rantings, Writings and Rabidity, the rock stars of the 17th century evangelism. Or to put it in another way, basically, I will explain this as we go through it, but it's a look at some 17th century autobiographical writings, specifically those that have some paranormal experiences recorded as firsthand and genuine. And then it's a consideration after that of how I got into being interested in this particular cul-de-sac, because I've probably got a lot less interest to start with than say people like CJ and Dave Sivier. I know you actually studied it at university. I'm a latecomer to this and actually found it through quite an unusual route, which I'll talk about halfway through the talk. But basically, if we go through first of all how this started. Give me a second. Right, you can see the second slide. Okay, right. I don't know why, but I was just spooling through all the attendees there. How this came about. So first of all, I got talking to Matt Arnold. I just went through the attendees list earlier on, and I can't see whether Matt's in tonight or not, but I got talking to Matt Arnold at last year's Seriously Strange, which is how this has actually come about, because I was reading something on 17th century autobiography and specifically paranormal accounts in 17th century autobiography last summer, and the Christian parapsychologist was an obvious place that it might have been of some interest. So I got talking with Matt, and cutting a long story short, I've just submitted an article to the next Christian parapsychologist, which will cover some of the stuff that I'm talking about tonight. At the same time, I was putting the finishing touches to the book that's just come out. So it's actually available at the moment. I haven't started doing the press for it yet. That's early next week I start doing the interviews, so you probably haven't seen anything other than me blagging about it on Facebook occasionally. But yeah, absolutely. Why Mystery Matters, which I've co-authored with EK Knight, which I won't bore you with at the moment, but it's a book about why we should embrace all that is bigger than us, basically all that is bigger than we can understand, bigger than we can hope to understand, and about why that might be a good thing for our mental health. I will bang on a little bit about that at the Seriously Strange conference. I'm talking about putting the app into ASSAP, which I'll talk about at the end of it. But let's get straight to this. So one or two of the people that we're talking about, well, basically, in cutting a long story short, in the UK and particularly in England in the 17th century, there was such an explosion of printing that a lot of autobiographical writing started to appear, certainly at a much greater level and a much greater variety than had ever been known before. Along the way, some of those most motivated to take advantage of this were religious extremists, or people whose religious experience was such that they felt almost a divine impulse to write about it. One such, if you're familiar with him, is Arise Evans. And if you look at the bullet points there, I'll just go over this. The details on his life are, to say the least, sketchy. The most coherent bits and pieces we know about him are largely on the back of a few eyewitness accounts, which more or less agree with each other. One or two records, including the fact that he genuinely was arrested for impersonating Christ. And also the fact that he was a prolific enough writer that some of his writings have survived, particularly his autobiography, An Echo to the Voice from Heaven. So, by his own account, Arise Evans, and let's be clear here, Arise is probably a name that was given to him. It's unlikely to have been his given birth name. He was born in Wales, but whether he was called Rhys, Rice, that's not clear. He was known as Arise Evans. He was a religious zealot to the point where as the religious affiliations of the 17th century changed rapidly and people were often vehemently opposed to each other, Arise Evans was notorious for his outspoken and sometimes if not physically violent, mentally violent approaches to other religions. But he's remembered partly because there are one or two instances in his life where, without any doubt, he appears to have done something that could potentially be construed as paranormal. He genuinely did tell the Earl of Essex that he would be blessed with promotion. Now, you could put that down to common sense. If you looked at certain people in Parliament these days, you might be able to predict that where they will end up is at higher standing, cabinet minister rank or something like that than they are at the moment. I was having this discussion, as you do, over a drink last weekend in the pub, and was discussing what I'm doing tonight. And as somebody, the person to whom I was speaking predicted that Helen Whately, who is our current MP, might end up higher in the political standings than she currently is. Well, he's arguing to me on Friday night that he knows that because it's to do with all the people that she's networked with. Arise Evans thought that his premonitions were divinely inspired. He said himself, and this is in the quote at the bottom there, is that he didn't care what men said of him, basically. If blasphemy is in him, then Christ blasphemes. In other words, his take on his own divinity was that effectively we're in David Icke territory. He's part of the Godhead. And one or two people like him were motivated to write. Their lives were recorded in pamphlets, in eyewitness accounts, in other people's autobiographies. We've got the beginnings of a map of how people interpreted their own religious experiences at the time. And whilst this is not exactly unique, if you were to turn the clock back to the medieval mystics and people like Marjorie Kemp, you would find first-hand accounts then. It's just that the 17th century, because of a number of changes that came about in terms of publishing, in terms of higher levels of literacy, the 17th century has left us a richer record than the time before it. Okay? And Christian was talking to me before. Yes, literally, Arthur Brown had a flaming helmet, but it didn't start there. Another well-known religious zealot whose life and inspiration are recorded well enough that we actually know quite a lot about them, and that we know that their own take on their own condition was that religion, effectively divinity, worked through them. Well, one other such was Solomon Eccles, or Solomon Eagle as he was known. There's quite a lot known about Solomon Eccles. His dates of birth and death are right, whereas with Arise Evans, by the time of his death, he was so obscure that actually the time, place, means of his death are not known. Solomon Eccles, slightly better known. He was quite a significant musician, and had composed, and a lot of his compositions were quite well known. During the Great Plague, he either had a breakdown, or God told him that London was being punished, and he genuinely believed it. So unfortunately, most of his music, which was highly regarded at the time, has not survived because, apart from anything else, he personally burnt his own manuscripts. Secondly, the period of time in which he was a religious zealot to the point that he was actually sharing his own divine view of everything publicly in the streets is very well recorded. And the little bit at the bottom of the slide there that you're looking at, that he went about denouncing of judgment upon the city in a frightful manner, sometimes quite naked and with a pan of burning charcoal on his head. What he said or pretended, indeed, I couldn't learn. That is literally quoted directly from Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Now, to just take a little bit of a diversion here so that we, I promptly see off the questions at the end of it. You've got to suspect the literal truth of Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year for no other reason than it's a first-person narration. You've only got to do the maths on it. Daniel Defoe was about 6 during the plague. But if we accept for the sake of argument that the main character in the first-person narrator in Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year is Daniel Defoe's interpretation of his own uncle, i.e. Henry Foe, who was a saddler in Aldgate and would have seen all these things, and Daniel Defoe is recounting what he was told, then we can reasonably assume that most of the stories about Solomon Eagle, who was pretty well known at the time and was pretty well talked about for a long time after his death, that most of those are actually true. But again, this is somebody whose life is well enough known that there is no question that his religious revelations that were given to people freely in the street came from a place of sincerity, even if everybody listening didn't literally believe it. So the second point to make, without getting into the whole religious history of the 17th century, clearly we're dealing with a period here where, amongst other things, one king was executed. There was conflict between Protestants and Catholics before we even get into the various denominational sects and the dissenters. And as I was bantering with Christian over the weekend about this, if you want to dig right down into it, you've got other sects that existed at the time, like the Ranters, where it is even conceivable that whilst they're recorded as existing, that they didn't actually exist, certainly not in the way that they were presented. That's by the by. What I want to talk about is the fact that within certain writings, then, if you want to go and look this up afterwards, there's a slide right at the very end where I'll give you a kind of top 5 hit list of people whose work you can easily find, which will be quite interesting to read. But another such is Richard Norwood, who lived to a ripe old age. Richard Norwood was 85 when he died. And he was a Calvinist most of his life, but he was almost a Catholic. He almost had a conversion moment, and this is recorded in his own autobiographical writings in his journal. But what's also recorded in his journal, and this is something I'll come back to later with regard to how we might understand these writings now, what's also recorded in his journal is a long and very desperate battle in his own mind to allow divinity to come through him, to allow himself to do the work of God, but at the same time, not to give in to the temptations that are very, very real as far as he's concerned. He makes reference to nocturnal pollutions frequently in his autobiographical writings, basically in his younger days. I mean, effectively, he's talking about wet dreams. But interestingly, as he battles for his own lucidity, I guess, as he battles to be in control of his own life, as he battles for a kind of self-actualization that includes God, along the way, he talks about experiences which are, without any doubt, paranormal as we would understand them today. And this is a literal quote from his journal. I was not able to stir when the disease was upon me, i.e. basically when he's not sure exactly what state he's in. Yet I could usually remember where I was and who was in the room with me. I seemed to see a thing on my breast or belly like a hare or a cat. Now, on the one hand, he's interpreting this as if demon beings are coming to him. On the other hand, you and I might see it in a completely pragmatic way. My own take on this, and we'll come to this in a minute, is that I think this one might be, you could quite easily explain it in certain ways, not least of which is that the work of David Hufford, I'm assuming that the book that you're looking at there, The Terror That Comes in the Night, is actually quite well known to most of the people I'm talking to tonight. If not, it's talking about hypnagogic, hypnopompic, experiences. It's talking about things like sleep paralysis and how we might experience those. And clearly it discusses experiences that are presented as paranormal that might not be. Just do the medical maths on this. In the case of Norwood in particular, you might well be talking about somebody who, because he just doesn't want to relieve his sexual frustrations in the most obvious way that a young person might on their own, he's trying to sleep and he's full of adrenaline and testosterone to the point where he's probably falling in and out of sleep. But again, that's me looking at it from 2023. His autobiography lucidly and sincerely describes encounters with demonic beings. But this is lifted from David Hufford just to get a kind of yardstick on the stuff we've talked about so far. The painting you're looking at there, The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli, well, that's on the cover of David Hufford's book. I just thought I'd reference that because it's discussed in the book as a very close representation to a lot of the encounters that were reported in the 17th, 18th centuries with demons. And there's discussion in the book about how sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations and whatever might lead to that, right? David Hufford's take on it himself there. So the hallucinations basically occurring before sleep are defined by the location, and those occurring during sleep onset during REM sleep are defined by their association with sleep paralysis. I'm mentioning that because if you were to go and look into Norwood's book in more detail, you'll find that actually his encounters, his nighttime encounters actually do fall into both of those categories. Okay, but it's not anywhere near as simple as that. If you're remotely interested in this and you can get your hands on it, arguably the best book written about 17th century autobiography, certainly in a sort of pragmatic way that doesn't bury itself in any particular religious or doesn't bury itself in any particularly literary theory. It seeks to just do content analysis and throw things at you. Paul Delaney's book, basically, he says at this point, early in his book, that there was a militant elite who constituted a spiritual aristocracy, though sometimes only in their own estimation. Crudely, it's a recognition of the fact that a lot of 17th century autobiography, which was still relatively a novel literary form in the UK, and particularly in England, where most of this stuff was written, a lot of it is based on people. There's a self-justification, and spiritual aristocracy is if your sincere spiritual experiences are presented in your own work as if they are, the process of a long struggle to actually find the right religious viewpoint, to actually achieve some kind of divine intervention in your own life, then you've got an argument, albeit self-justifying, that says that you lived a good life at a time of great religious turmoil. I mean, effectively, that's what Paul Delaney's looking at. And one of the reasons that his 1971 study of 17th century autobiography is taken as definitive is that he drags a lot of the more obscure items in there. I mean, this is 1971, so they're easier to source these days because you can find some of the stuff I'm talking about on Project Gutenberg. He had to put a lot of work into finding physical manuscripts, and a lot of these manuscripts had actually been held in historic houses and other places to the point where they didn't really become widely available until the Victorian era, or in some cases later than that. My 2023 take on it would be that we're so familiar with autobiography now, the whole business of autobiographical sincerity, that self-justifying, what a literary critic would term validity. In other words, you can't assume that autobiographies are reliable. You can't assume that a different person in the same circumstances would come to the same conclusions. But the least you can look for is that they're valid, that the evidence that they present justifies the conclusions that they come to. Certainly, there's an attempt to do that in the 17th century autobiographies. These days, things like the Misery memoirs are very much that animal. They've got validity in the sense that however out there they seem to be and however strange the lives they're recounting, the ones that are most celebrated often have a link between the extreme events of the lives and the conclusions that they come to. And one person who's worth a look at this, for the simple reason that his perspective over his lifetime changed drastically, is Hugh Peters, who's the guy pictured on the slide there. Hugh Peters was a prolific writer. His ability to survive in the febrile political and religious climate of the 17th century is truly remarkable, albeit when it goes wrong spectacularly. Apologies if any of you are familiar with this guy. I'll assume that that you're not, and just go over the main points here. When I say he did okay, he was closely associated during the Civil War. He was on the Royalist side. And not only on the Royalist side, but actually well known to Charles I. Now, obviously, the Royalist side in the Civil War lost, and a lot of the leading lights on the royalist side didn't get out of it alive. Hugh Peters did. And when I'm making a kind of jokey reference there, if you look into the two executioners who killed Charles I, as in the people who were literally up in front of the crowd removing his head and displaying it, it is entirely possible that one of them was Hugh Peters. Circumstantially, there's very good evidence that he was. So if you think about how far he moved from being a royalist supporter to potentially being one of the executioners of Charles I, it all went horribly wrong in 1660, and the events of the circumstances of his death basically are an execution, but a pretty vindictive execution, because by this point a lot of his past had caught up with him. And what is definitely true, I mean, there's certain rumors about this, but what is definitely true is that he was one of two people executed, and he was brought close enough to the first guy that was being hung, drawn and quartered, and was a personal friend, that he was made to suffer in terms of actually looking at what was about to happen to him. He's relevant here because he's a yardstick by which we might look at somebody like Norwood. In Hugh Peters' case, there is a sincerity, apparently there's a validity to all his writings, but clearly in terms of his political and to a certain extent his religious position, he does move significantly. And as I just mentioned earlier on, his survival from royalist to doing very well under Cromwell is actually quite remarkable, certainly for the period. It was only when Charles I's son took over that it all went horribly wrong. All right. But I promised you the rock stars of 17th century evangelism. So this is Elvis. Apologies about the mention about the boss-eyed Bill Haley stare. Sorry, I'm a bit dry in the throat. I'm going to take a sip, and at this point, I will leave you to read the revelatory moment from John Bunyan's autobiography. So the last time I spoke to somebody about this, the first question was, what's a game of cat? Tip cat. Basically it's a kind of stick game, which has got a kind of shuttle and a stick, and you throw one up in the air and it hits it with the stick. And it was quite a popular village green game. John Bunyan played it on a Sunday, and apart from anything else, that was a practice that was quite common, but was also quite commonly frowned on. And it was a place where there were regular weekly arguments about whether you should actually, about what was appropriate in terms of behavior, basically. I'm not being completely facetious about John Bunyan's boss-eyed stare. Weirdly, as you do, I was reading Marty Feldman's autobiography last weekend, and he makes a point about his eyes, which were probably a side effect of a thyroid condition that he had. And he makes a point that, for better or worse, the making of him was that when he got onto a four-handed sketch show at last, a 1948 show in the 1960s, his physical appearance actually singled him out as a comedian, and probably was instrumental to getting him signed up in America before the Pythons and people like that were making movies over there. John Bunyan's ability to mesmerize an audience by looking at them partly was significant in his status as a star preacher, but so was the moment that you're looking at. There is absolutely no doubt about what's here. When I wrote the article for the Christian Parapsychologist, I actually quoted from a very recent book written in the last decade, which is a book for young Christians in America, which discusses John Bunyan as a life that, to this day, to the 21st century, that young American Christians might want to imitate and learn from. And central to it is that he had a divine revelation in the middle of playing with his friends, basically, on out on a field on a Sunday. God spoke to him. He's not doing this in any way other than saying that this was a sincere thing that actually happened. He was spoken to directly. This happened to him. He experienced it. It was a first-hand experience. It was a life-changing experience. It's written up in his autobiography. It was central to his preaching. It was central to the way that he was understood as an inspirational and significant social figure of the time. All right. And he was inspirational quite literally on somebody else. You'll find both of these people have written autobiographically as well. Agnes Beaumont, so there's a whole story about her. She was known to Bunyan, significantly younger than Bunyan, but one rumor, certainly believed by her dad, was that she'd had an affair with him. The picture here depicts John Bunyan as he's traveling as a preacher, meeting Agnes Beaumont, and there's a whole story in her autobiography, which is also written into biographies of Bunyan, where she basically rode pillion on his horse, which scandalized some people, but her take on it was that she was getting involved in the evangelical preaching of John Bunyan. It led to a massive falling out with her father. Her life is quite interesting after that, which we won't go into, but it is in her autobiography. But key to this, a life-changing moment, which actually to a certain extent echoes the moment in John Bunyan's Grace Abounding, is that there is a scene when she returns after riding pillion with John Bunyan, and her father locks her out of the house because he's scandalized at the way that she's behaved. And she's outside, basically sleeping in an outbuilding, and she's beset by the devil that night. And again, it's presented in such a way that it's not seen as, you know, it's not figurative, it's literal. You know, she's beset by the devil. She experiences that first-hand experience. Somebody else who's worth looking into, and I'm just mentioning it here to give some kind of wider context to these writings, is the work of John Crook. Now, again, I'm being a bit flippant to say that he's the Quaker's answer to Bunyan. His autobiography is, to say the least, very interesting. He's, I suppose, if you were wanting the shorthand religious terminology for a lot of the autobiographical writing, John Crook is a seeker, but he comes to divine revelation in Lost Sheep Found through being something of a charlatan. So he experiments with magic and divination, which includes in his own autobiographical writing actually fairly blatant accounts of how some things like predictions, for example, he's describing, nearest makes no odds, cold reading, and some of the tricks that we might accuse people of using these days when they pretend to have some predictive ability. By the end of his autobiography, that's not where he is. He, as a Quaker, he's found himself, and the point of the book partly is to tell you the story, which again, we're talking about validity. The internal evidence justifies ultimately the lost sheep being found, i.e. basically that Quakerism has brought meaning to his life. But let's have another look at it. Interestingly, Thomas Nash. So I'm not suggesting that he is literally ASSAP. He's the nearest thing to ASSAP that the 17th century religious autobiographers had, because apart from anything else, he's a skeptic, but he's an ASSAP type of skeptic. He's a mischievous skeptic. He's somebody who finds fun in skepticism, and whilst he was mainly a satirist, he wrote one particularly well-received text, the Terrors of the Night. Because he was well connected in London, he was amongst the first people to be taking full advantage of pamphlet printing, just widely circulated text, or what would count as widely circulated text at the end of the 16th century. And this is a direct quote from the Terrors of the Night from 1594. Senor Satan, when he was a young stripling and had not yet gotten perfect audacity to set upon us in the daytime, was a sly politician in dreams, but those days are gone with him. And now that he is thoroughly settled in his scutchery, he plays above board boldly and sweeps more stakes than ever he did before. In other words, he's a sociologist before sociology. He's effectively arguing that Satan is something of a movable concept, and that in his lifetime he's seen shifts in the meaning of Satan. He's not taking this literally. I'm saying anyone for scutchery there. I'll keep on talking, but if this was a live audience, we'd have a quick debate about what scutchery actually is. I hadn't a clue. I had to look it up. It's a process. It's actually a pretty well used word because it gives you a sense of how his palette of information that he's shoehorning into his somewhat cynical view of the whole thing. It gives you a sense of how broadly it goes. Scutchery is a part of the process of preparing cotton, where you separate out the impurities. So Satan is settled in his scutchery, right? Because he separates out the things he doesn't need before he gets on with the finishing process. Okay. There was a few of you were involved in a brief debate. I was having a really boring Saturday. Last Saturday, I was, well, not boring, but I was working on the article. It was getting a bit bloody intense, and I just put something up on Facebook, which I thought was a bit of a joke about. It just struck me that Matthew Hopkins is perhaps closer to the 27 club of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain than he'd like to admit, which I'll talk about in a minute. I just put a little throwaway post up there about something I was thinking. I was surprised at the detailed answers. And CJ rightly took me to task about describing Matthew Hopkins as a Puritan, which he, technically speaking, he wasn't. And that's significant because Puritanism in its purest form would not actually admit, for example, the existence of witchcraft in the way that Matthew Hopkins was seeking it. So it's actually right. Despite the skepticism of Nash that we just looked at, despite the different viewpoints, revelatory viewpoints of the autobiographical writers we've looked at, by the mid-17th century, there was another thing going on, which is that witches, i.e. the paranormal, the demon-haunted paranormal, was being seen and discovered and experienced all over the place, but particularly in Suffolk, Norfolk, Essex, places like that. And one of the two leading lights in such discoveries is the guy that's now remembered as the Witchfinder General. If you're unfamiliar with this, I don't want to go too far down the line, because basically, if I get all this wrong, I'm well aware that one or two people who are listening in know more about this than me, but without any doubt, Matthew Hopkins, he was not appointed by Parliament as the Witchfinder General. There is a certain self-styling about the whole thing that he set up. It's relevant here because, as you'll see in a minute, he justifies his own discoveries with a fairly self-referential book. But I'm not joking also about the fact that, ironically, he might be closer to the kind of hard living people than he'd like to admit, simply because the whole point of the 27 Club, and Matthew Hopkins was around the age of 27. Let's be clear about this. If you read anything on the 27 Club of rock stars and similar people who died young, it doesn't take long before you've started to admit people who were not 27. James Dean's reckless lifestyle killed him at the age of 24. If you look on the cover of the dad rock mags that have just come out, there's a couple of them are doing big articles on Nick Drake, because there's a significant biography, which is the first time that anybody's actually got access to the Nick Drake archive that's owned by his sister. I've seen Nick Drake discussed as a 27 Club member, and he wasn't a hard-living, public drug-taking kind of 27 Club member, and he wasn't even 27 when he died. He was only 26. But the point of it is that, nominally speaking, the 27 Club is a bunch of people who died young as a result of living lifestyles that were heedless of certain dangers, because they were so driven to do the things that they thought were the only things that they should be doing, i.e. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin combined a lot of partying with their music making. Kurt Cobain indulged the worst side of his personality to make the music, which was probably central to his death. Matthew Hopkins' take on this, which I think is quite ironic in the sense that I would claim him almost as an honorary member of the 27 Club. If you read any of the accounts, his relentless pursuit of witches included long night rides. He died the circumstances of his death are not particularly precise, but extreme respiratory failure of some kind, and probably brought on by his lifestyle. The lifestyle driven by the need to find witches. I mean, by the time of, if you look into this, and I'm sure some of you are already well familiar with it, but his ability to find witches and then get paid for finding witches was such that by the time he died, there were significant debts that had been run up by certain towns where there had been mass hangings. He wasn't cheap to hire. He was very effective at finding the witches, which meant that he was continuing to justify his own existence in his own mind. By the time he died, there was significant debate about whether he was actually genuinely finding witches. But let's get back to the point of the talk here. The sincere experience of the paranormal, full in your face, from people like Matthew Hopkins going looking for the evidence of the devil working through individuals, was also experienced by firsthand. I mean, a kind of Trumpian figure in a way. If you look at the ruling this week about Donald Trump, I know it seems a bit bizarre to some people that they then go and interview Republican women, and yeah, of course they'll vote for him, because they still believe in the guy, whatever. And Matthew Hopkins was such a figure. And to the end of his life, there were people who genuinely believed in what he was doing, not least of whom was himself, of course. And I'm assuming a lot of you have read his very, very short discovery of witches at some point. But if you haven't, well, let's just enjoy the logic here then. The book is a question and answer session, basically. He presumes to speak for his own interrogators and then justify himself. That's what the discovery of witches is mainly about. So he says, well, beside the unreasonable watching, they were extraordinarily walked till their feet were blistered and so forced through that cruelty to confess, etc. Basically, one way of getting witches to confess was to walk them, keep them awake at night, walk them up and down. This is sleep deprivation. The Geneva Convention has specific rulings about why you can't do this to enemy combatants in the 21st century or even in the 20th century when they wrote it. That said, you can't fault Matthew Hopkins' logic. His answer to whether that is a brutal way of finding witches is to say, well, basically, when they be suffered so to couch, immediately comes their familiars into the room and scareth the watchers and hearteneth on the watch. In other words, we can't stop walking them, because the second they sit down, the familiars will come in the room. The people who are watching the witches will be absolutely terrified. And we can't do that to these God-fearing people who are working with us to discover the witches. Well, you can't knock the logic, can you? So how they might be, the second part of the talk is how would we consider these people today? In other words, if I'm trying to be true to the mission of ASSAP, we're scientifically studying the paranormal. My side of it, as you'll discover in a minute, is that I might take on a social scientific study of the paranormal. My take on that is that if you apply all the logic and what we know, and you still can't explain every case of claimed paranormal, then the ones that you can't easily explain with all the knowledge you can prove are probably the ones that are worth investigating, because they're your shortest route to either a new discovery or something that is genuinely paranormal as we'd understand it. By complete contrast, a lot of the witch finding, I'm assuming this is a best-selling book and has been a best-selling book for ages, so I'm assuming, again, I'm talking to quite a few people who've read it. But as Malcolm Gaskill points out, there were other reasons why people were considered to be witches. And for example, as some previously common land had been taken into private ownership, and as you'd got a lot of families who'd lost breadwinners either to extreme disability or to death as a result of the Civil War, more people were dependent on charities. Wages and parish handouts had stayed the same, i.e. inflation had overtaken them, a situation we'd recognize in 2023. And effectively people were dragged into the depths of poverty without hope of rising again. Crudely, one reason that a lot of people, particularly women, middle-aged and older women, were witches was because they were desperate. They were prepared to do anything. They weren't particularly well educated. They were, to a certain extent, seen as a threat by people who'd got more money and things to lose. And particularly a lot of these women, as is discussed in Malcolm Gaskell's book, you're talking about people who'd been widowed. So their lives were desperate. And I've seen a similar discussion in 2023 that in one sense, this whole thing about the Wagner mercenaries and in Bakhmut at the moment, and the head of the Wagner group threatening to pull his men out because they're not getting enough ammunition. Well, it's a horrific situation, but the truth is that the Russians have let a lot of people who are the most desperate in society out with a pardon for as long as they're prepared to fight for the country. So to a certain extent, their lives are exceptionally cheap. And there are people in whose interest it would be if a lot of that problem was wiped out by the Ukrainians. Now, I don't want to get into a debate about that, other than to say that this phenomena where sometimes we might be absolutely indifferent to the fate of people whose needs are as we could actually understand if we could move to be more empathic. It's not a new phenomena, and it's one of the reasons certainly that some people were taken to be witches and were treated as witches, and it's discussed in one or two of the books about the witch finders, including that particular bestseller there. So I don't think it's actually so far away from our more contemporary experience. I talked on one of these webinars last year about sort of satanic and the paranormal in rock music, and I'm going to revisit that in a second, just one part of it. But the whole notion of there being kind of witches, demons, some dark paranormal menace that's lurking in a particular corner that we have to go and deal with because it's threatening the mainstream views. And we understand it first and foremost because there are tales that are presented to us that are vivid and lurid and threatening. That's not new. And we've all grown up on various versions of that. If I'm old enough to remember The Exorcist being a kind of moral panic situation. And luckily, where I grew up, if you're prepared to pay full price for a film in one or two of the places near where I lived, including Carlisle, the one city, they'd let you into anything within reason. So I saw The Exorcist when I was 14, but by the time I saw it, I'd already heard the rumours going around school about, oh man, a guy went mad and they had to call an ambulance and stop the film and stuff like that. Well, no. As far as I'm aware, that didn't happen where I lived. But this whole notion of there being moral panics, this is an infamous case because Michelle remembers the distance between what the book claims and the actual truth is out on the internet. But it's a moral panic. It's claiming all the same kind of demonic sincerities and realities of the 17th century, the worst 17th century tales. But because it's within living memory, we know the people involved, and it's not necessarily what it seems to be. And similarly, I spoke about this last year, but I just thought it's relevant here because, again, this is a moral panic that got totally out of hand. And excuse me while I look down and read, because I can never pronounce these Nordic names unless I'm actually reading them. You're looking at three acts leading lights of satanic music in one way or another, and there are two people just visible in the middle picture. But from the left, let's go with the mainstream one, Glenn Benton of Deicide, who effectively has successfully walked a kind of tightrope between apparently serious satanic influence and enough financial success that the band are actually, I don't know what you might describe his band as durable. He and the band, long successful career by the standards of kind of cold metal. The Dead Center and Dead Right, if you're unfamiliar with these two, well, basically, so on the left of the shot, you're looking at, I'll give this one a go, known as Pelle Olin, but Pierre Ingve, I believe you pronounce it. He died on the 8th of April, 1991. he was known as Dead. So he's on the left, the shot in the middle, you just see a bit of his face. His stage name was Dead, because he was part of the kind of black metal Norwegian scene. And when he committed suicide, the guy to the right of him, who was Øystein Aarseth, and they were both from the band Mayhem. Aarseth actually got in, was the one who discovered the body, and he couldn't get through the front door. So he basically broke into the house, found his bandmate dead, and before reporting this, his bandmate, who actually performed on stage under the stage name of Dead, he found him dead, and before reporting it to any authorities, he posed pictures of his bandmate because he thought it's exactly what he'd have wanted. And despite the fact that Mayhem had just lost a central member, he thought that this was actually good for the band. Mayhem and Burzum, who are another rival black metal band, were in a kind of war of words and kind of mutual sneering at each other with regard to who was the biggest, who were basically the biggest Satanists on the scene. Well, when that was eventually resolved by Aarseth, who'd found his bandmate's body, was murdered by the guy on the right, Varg Vikernes, who was the leader of the band Burzum. So effectively, this entire scene, which was driven partly by their own understanding of Satanism and the kind of pagan powers in Norway, was resolved by a murder of one member of one band on another. A fairly recent moral panic. I mean, the events of this are just over 30 years ago. So Varg Vikernes, who's on the right there, is now a free man again, and he's middle-aged. If I just take a little diversion here, if you're unfamiliar with the music, the weird thing is that the most interesting music that came out of this scene, in my humble opinion, i.e. the stuff I've played on my own radio show over the years, when Varg Vikernes went to jail and was deprived of his band and left alone basically with a very simple keyboard, he actually made a couple of darkly, strangely compelling albums. And that's a whole other story, which seemed to embody a lot of the kind of feelings and seem to give voice to something that's quite nebulous in their whole understanding of what paganism sounds and feels like. But like I say, that's a whole other story. As is this, but I'm going to tell you it. This is how I got into 17th century autobiography. So unlike Christian and Dave, I didn't do this as a first degree. When I taught professional writing, and when I was, when I started doing my own writing, which included autobiographical stuff, I got very interested in what's known as creative nonfiction, but in its earliest incarnation was the new journalism. And again, if you're unfamiliar with this, the leading lights thereof would include the guy you're looking at on the left of the slide, Tom Wolfe. They would also include strangely, some of these people are quite durable. Gay Talese, the last time I looked, is still alive. Ken Kesey was another member of this club. It's mainly male, although people like Joyce Carol Oates would qualify as well. But the gist of it is that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, to a certain extent, and then from the mid-1960s to a massive extent, there was an explosion of a form of non-fiction writing that took on board the delivery styles of fiction. Tom Wolfe's book, The New Journalism, compiles a lot of the best of it, but the significant thing is that at the beginning of The New Journalism, there is an essay by Tom Wolfe, and effectively what he's claiming is that new journalism, American new journalism, is a completely new form of writing, and that the reason it's come about is that novelists have, as well, he describes it as leaving the stage, that effectively as society changed rapidly, novelists simply couldn't cope with it, and it fell to journalists to write the most vivid, most compelling, most significant prose describing what was going on from the late 1950s onwards. So this is I'll tell you how this led me to reading 17th century's autobiographies. The more I read of this, the more I loved the writings. So people like Ken Kesey, that you can't argue that within the new journalism are classics. So Ken Kesey on the road with the merry pranksters, taking loads of drugs and living in ways that previously had been unfashionable, other than to a cultish elite, is, it's great, compelling writing of its time. The problem is, when I came to read the new journalism and study this stuff, I didn't believe him. I didn't believe his claim that nobody had ever done this before. And yet it was actually quite difficult to disprove it, because on his own terms, he's right. And yet if you were to take a kind of methodical approach to it, in other words, if you were to study this, if you were to take a literal academic approach to it, well, if he's claiming these people are unique, that's a proposition that in scientific terms is falsifiable. You've simply got to find somebody who's done it before. Like most claims, if you're making an academic claim, if you predict the future, if you can actually say, if your claim says, well, what's going to happen in the future, and you're right, then clearly you've got a lot more credibility to what you're doing. Yeah. If you can withstand people who will attempt to demolish your argument with their own evidence, again, you've got something to work on. And my take on it was that, and this is just stuff that I studied for myself, Tom Wolfe's argument crumbled, and I got very interested in how you could actually demolish that argument. This was for a master's degree years ago, for an assignment on a master's degree. Where would you find the evidence? In other words, Tom Wolfe had a point, because in the 1960s, Britain's response was strangely different to the Americans. So things like, to give you an example here, when Oz magazine went on trial for obscenity, it was interesting that the issue that, if you're unfamiliar with Oz magazine, it was a magazine of the hippie era, an alternative magazine. They ended up on trial in London for obscenity, and specifically the issue that was apparently obscene was a thing called the School Kids Oz, where the editors had done what was quite an alternative thing for the day. They'd walked away from their editorial job, other than to do a kind of light touch overseeing of it, and they had literally brought in school kids to edit their magazine, which by the late 1960s standards was an extremely radical thing to do. Long story short, some of the contents of the School Kids Oz led to the obscenity trial. Now, what's interesting is, if you read Tony Palmer's book on this, it's quite... one of the problems Oz had, which was not a problem in San Francisco, was that when they brought in school kids thinking that they were going to edit Oz magazine, so the first thing the editors thought was, oh, great, we've got some kids in. We'll just let them loose on it, because they'll go hog wild on this. And they were appalled to discover that these kids actually liked going to school. These were 15, 16 older British school students, and they actually quite liked school. They thought it was great that they were editing a magazine, but they were not the cultural renegades that the Oz editors had been expecting. They weren't people that Tom Wolfe was celebrating in the United States. So apologies for the rant here, but the point I'm making is that you can't demolish Tom Wolfe's argument about the new journalism by saying that Britain or other countries at the time were doing the same things that the Americans were doing, that they simply weren't. So I set off to try and find almost like a replica, some situation in the history of British literature where the same social factors were applying, where there was absolutely massive social change, where the literature that was being produced had to be literature in the moment, self-justifying literature in the moment, where all you could rely on was first-hand intense experience, because actually the cultural norms that that were applying themselves were not solid. And my argument would be crudely that actually, if you go back to the 17th century, to the religious turmoil, to this sudden explosion of autobiographical writing because there was a literate public and it was cheaper in real terms to publish than it had ever been before, and there was an audience for it, a much bigger audience for this kind of thing, and also that it was a way that people spoke to each other in terms of autobiography in just the same way that Tom Wolfe's generation was speaking to each other to a certain extent by posting articles in magazines and newspapers and sharing the experiences that way. So my argument in an assignment years and years ago was that 17th century Britain, particularly in religious turmoil, actually bore more of a relevant relationship in terms of just circumstantially, a lot of the conditions were similar to 1960s San Francisco and New York than you'd think. Okay. And also that underpinning this is the fact that we like the enigmatic in stories, that we're always making sense of the world in our own stories. So let's just take it's always very kind of you when I'm introduced on an ASSAP webinar, I'm often described as entertaining. I must go and tell my wife. But I think this is an entertaining thing. If you're unfamiliar with the guy on the right, he actually makes a fleeting appearance in my book, Why Mystery Matters, and he's a local hero where I grew up. His name is Will Ritson, and he was the landlord of the Stanton Bridge Inn in Nether Wasdale in Cumbria in the 19th century. What matters is that Will Ritson was a landlord of a Cumbrian inn at the time when stagecoaches and eventually railways were making travel around Britain easier than it had been. Consequently, Cumbria, with its gorgeous lake district, was experiencing a tourist boom, the like of which it had never seen before. So you'd got rich offcomers encountering local characters for the first time. If you're unfamiliar with Will Ritson, please go and Google him. To this day, the World Liars Championship is held in the pub where he was the landlord, and it celebrates Will Ritson. The point being that Will Ritson, one of his most endearing characteristics was when these people arrived in his pub, he would straight-faced tell barefaced lies to them. This is why we celebrate the World Liars Championship. Now, it's significant, it's relevant to storytelling to the 17th century autobiographies and the religious experiences and the demonic manifestations for two reasons. First of all, because occasionally in the stories that Will Ritson told and the stories that were told in the area, the paranormal and the uncanny was a big feature, right? Secondly, because his stories are celebrated to this day for the same reasons that we often celebrate the most uncanny first-hand accounts of paranormal encounters and similar, because in those moments when the stories come alive, I mean, look, we're all listening to uncanny, right? But if I use the word uncanny, Danny Robbins' putting together of his shows is an absolute masterclass in this. You're always a few seconds, apparently, away from a revelation, and the stories are always told in a way that they're tangible. You know, the enigmas that you experience are going on vividly in your mind. You're given just enough to conjure up that kind of image. Now, Will Ritson, who was a landlord and was famous for these stories and was celebrated locally, and you know, his marks were always the people that walked into the pub for the first time, and they were just set up there. There's some cracking stories that are celebrated. I know that if you look online, for example, one of the ones, because it's easy to tell, he once convinced some tourists from the south that turnips in Cumbria grew so big that they were actually hollowed out, and they used to keep cattle in them in the rain. More recently, the World Liars Championship, it's so celebrated, albeit it's a cult thing, that it's actually attracted famous people. The first female winner of the World Liars Championship in Nether Wasdale was Sue Perkins, the comedian. And that was in 2006, if I remember rightly. And it's a great folk tradition. I mean, I won't bore you with it, but it's something my dad told me, barefaced lies, to make me a critical thinker. I've done the same to my own kids. It's not just a northern tradition, but it's very much a big kind of northern tradition. Excuse me, but while I've been ranting about this slide, a small example of that has been hidden in plain sight right in front of you. I've seen people, you know, tell me about, I used to discuss it with my professional writing students, and they'd go and find the details about Will Ritson on the website. And they'd miss the obvious thing. 1808 to 1890, but he was 83 years old when he died. Just do the maths on it. The straight-faced site celebrates the fact that he was 83 when he couldn't possibly have been, and most people believe it. You know, so even the official site celebrating him to these days lies in front of you. and does it in such a way that you might just miss it completely. Now, I use this slide. I will be honest. I've already started doing talks on that Why Mystery Matters book. I haven't even started doing the publicity for it yet. But what on earth possessed a Women's Institute group to book me for that particular talk? I don't know. But this slide caused a bit of consternation because I asked people who that was on the left, and a couple of people came forward with one of them thought she's an actress, and somebody else thought that she was a singer. She doesn't exist. I pulled that from thispersondoesnotexist.com because it's AI applying itself to generating a face that looks convincing. The point I'm making is that there is a part of our makeup in terms of how we process stories, how we understand things, that simply responds to these, puts a kind of pareidolia together, if you like, or apophenia, which is the cultural variation thereof. You know, we make meaning on these nuggets that we're given. Now, that doesn't mean that everything I told you about 17th century autobiographical writings talking about demonic experiences or religious experiences is wrong. But it simply means that all of this stuff, whether it's true or false, how we experience it, works in a storytelling tradition because it's the way we experience these. And different periods in time, different eras have their own way of doing it. Will Ritson is celebrated to this day because he used his pub as if it was a theatre and his audience were the locals. And the fact that he got people that were not local to believe the biggest lies and everybody kept quiet because they were laughing on the inside was of its day. A current manifestation is that artificial intelligence can now produce people like our friend on the left here, who are very, very convincing. We respond to them as if they're humans and we think we know them, but she's not. Okay. A more kind of down-to-earth version of this, and I don't need to go into this in a huge amount of detail, other than to say that we might be living in a more secular age, but we still have similarities to these autobiographical writings that are valid because they take us on a very difficult, personal and uncanny journey and come to some resolution. The woman on the left is Raina Wynn, and if you're unfamiliar with her best-selling book, The Salt Path, which is the first of the 3 autobiographical memoirs that she's written. The gist of the story is that Raina Wynn and her husband Moth, who's still alive but he's terminally ill, through a series of unfortunate circumstances, became homeless around the time that he discovered he was terminally ill. So they literally had nowhere to go. So The Salt Path is an account of how they actually cope with this. They started walking the southwest coast path, and miraculous sort of things happened. Moth's illness, whilst he's not going to be free of a terminal illness, he actually started to buck all the medical expectations. He didn't get as ill as it was expected. And the book is, whilst it's not completely positive, the book is, it's cathartic. They go through a lot of this kind of experience, and she's written 2 more since then. The writer on the right is less well known. That's Kathy Rensenbrink, but she's reading at that point from a book called The Last Act of Love, which again, whilst it's not exactly a religious memoir, is a memoir of deep personal suffering and catharsis. The gist of it is that she's in quite an unusual family to do with her parents, but they're a very functional, loving and very close family, and it's working perfectly. Her parents are well known in their local community in Yorkshire. They run a pub. Everything is going perfectly until Kathy Rensenbrink and her brother go out one night just to a village hall, and one of those chance things that would happen. She takes a lift home. He decides to stay a bit later because he's talking to some of his friends, and he's injured badly in a hit and run accident on the way home. And The Last Act of Love spends a lot of time talking about the last years of his life when effectively he doesn't recover. He recovers to the point where he's still alive, but he doesn't recover. And the last act of love is what you might imagine. It's the act of letting him go, basically. It's how they manage his death. Well, that's a secular take on it. Let's go another direction. Because, as I said earlier on, I'm quite on the skeptical side. If you can apply logic and academic insight to this, and you can use models that will try and explain it, then what's left, the uncanny stuff, is worth looking into. Well, a simple point here, if you're unfamiliar with these three people, I'm guessing probably quite a lot of you are familiar with them, but from top left, you're looking at Philip K. Dick, science fiction writer, Robert Anton Wilson, best known as the author of a hugely influential trilogy of science fiction novels. And then that's Timothy Leary, the Harvard academic who became an advocate of taking LSD. So three public figures who all had some profile in the 1960s and 1970s, all known users of psychedelic drugs, but bizarrely or not, in or around 1973, 1974, aliens spoke to all three of them, which is recorded in one way or another. I mean, if you're unfamiliar with this, I used to talk to my professional writing students about this book. One of the strangest books in terms of how it existed at all, ever published, is Philip K. Dick's novel Varlis. The strangeness is actually hidden in plain sight. Varlis was published as a science fiction novel because Philip K. Dick's sales and profile at the time was such that the publishers were very convinced that if they published it as an autobiography, it wouldn't have sold. They were doing, I mean, these days he's revered. He's one of these people. He's a Nick Drake kind of figure whose standing is out of all proportion to what he thought it would be on the day that he died. But Varlis is, to all intents and purposes, an autobiography. It's central to Varlis and the two books that followed is an incident that happened to Philip K. Dick in 1974, when effectively he was blasted with a beam and aliens spoke directly to him, and a lot of deep truths were revealed. And to a lesser extent, the other two characters on the slide all had these experiences. So the point I'm making is that I can be quite dismissive and quite secular about a lot of these things, but on the other hand, let's be completely clear, sometimes there are coincidences that are so uncanny, you almost struggle to dismiss them as just a kind of cultural facet. I mean, okay, we're looking at three middle-aged drug users in California in the 1960s, 1970s. They were all contacted by aliens at the same time. On the one hand, it's like, well, you know, maybe the social circumstances explain it. On the other hand, it is a little bit strange that all three of them would have a similar experience. So let's try and wrestle a little bit this under control. All I've tried to set out to do today really is to throw enough things up in the air that if you're unfamiliar with this, you've got quite a lot of reference points. I can put a bit of my opinion across. So I'm going to share a couple of opinions that I think make some sense of all of this. Again, Mark Fisher, if you're unfamiliar with Mark Fisher, his writings are quite heavy. He was a music journalist to start with, and you know, morphed into something that most music journalists don't become in terms of seeing a way bigger cultural picture. But what you're looking at there is Melvin Coverley sort of summarizing what Mark Fisher stood for, yeah? That his formulation of hauntology consists of two component parts, the no longer and the not yet. The former haunts the present from the past, the latter haunts the present from the future. Mark Fisher is central to this whole notion of the existence of the experience of hauntology, effectively that we're haunted by our past and present simultaneously, to the point where we actually struggle to live in the moment or make sense of it, that some of the feelings might be elliptical and enigmatic, and we might exist in that state at the same time as we're trying to make sense of present moments and do very conscious things. You can look at it that way. It's, to a certain extent, I think this is important to what we're talking about, because I think it speaks to the human condition. It speaks to a capacity that we all have to be in touch with the enigmatic and that which is beyond our senses almost all the time. Now, it can be destructive. I mean, if the end of Mark Fisher, if you're looking at Mark Fisher's dates there, he wasn't very old when he died, and the end was tragic and self-inflicted, and that, in a sense, it's almost the antithesis of the upside of what he was describing with hauntology, because it's the hauntology movement is something that these days attempts to create that experience. So, for example, leading lights in the hauntology movement would be the Ghost Box record label, I've played their stuff on my radio show, and it's deliberately enigmatic, but it's beautifully so. And they play with concepts of the past and how it might haunt us today, and they almost invent hauntings in their work, because they're doing it in a very secular way, but they couldn't possibly do what they do unless we had the capacity to be haunted effectively. And if we've stopped believing in the literal way that a lot of the 17th century writers did, then we can still create that experience for ourselves. A much more secular and pragmatic view of it is, so it's not, if you're still looking in, Christian, Christian looked ahead on the slides, and I said, well, because he was spotting people, I said, well, who's that? And his best candidate was Cliff Richard. No, it's Damian Thompson. Basically, Damian Thompson, who, amongst other things, has written for the likes of the New Statesman. In fact, let's put Cliff Richard to edit the New Statesman for a week or two. That would be interesting. But one of Damian Thompson's better written and I think more significant books, albeit it's not very long, is a book called Counter Knowledge. And effectively what he's talking about, excuse me, but I'll read off my crib sheet in a minute, but he's talking about counter knowledge, lifted directly from the book. Counter knowledge becomes an industry in the broadest sense of the word. It affects not only people's finances and careers, but also their personal lives, since access to supposedly secret information can shape the way that they think about themselves. In other words, he's taking a very pragmatic view of this. He's looking at the enigmatic and the uncanny and the way that it's commodified, basically, the way that it's turned into, that which we can trade, buy, sell. I'll read you something from sort of some online writing about Damian Thompson, then sort of drag this back into the real world in terms of the talk. But sorry, I accused him of being the New Statesman. He's a Spectator he works for. Yeah, they'd definitely put Cliff Richard in charge of that. We're experiencing, as he said it, a pandemic of credulous thinking. People are increasingly surrendering the values of the Enlightenment to accept a barrage of counter knowledge, which, according to Damian Thompson, is misinformation packaged to look like fact. It's a concept that embodies both theories for which there is no supporting evidence and theories against which there is already evidence that directly contradicts them. So I'm not saying this accounts for everything in the religious autobiographies and writings that I was talking about earlier on. I'm simply saying that one way we can understand some of that writing now is that it's something that we've always been doing, that we package these things up, and to a certain extent, some of the more enigmatic experiences have always been commodities. Damian Thompson's argument is about things like conspiracy theories. It's about the obvious misinformation that people in ASSAP might laugh at, because it's the ones that the stories that the most credulous people fall for. But then at other times maybe not. Some of the as some of you know, my main paranormal interest is ufology. Well, some of the biggest UFO cases have attracted the best brains in ufology. And to take an example, there were quite a few people in the mid-1990s prepared to believe that the Alien Autopsy movie was the real deal. But it isn't. One of the two guys who faked it now does UFO conferences explaining how he did it, showing conclusive proof that he did. So we keep going around in circles on this. This is just bringing Damian Thompson in the argument, is me trying to tie a certain corner of it down to the pragmatic that actually cultural critics have, can occasionally sort of blow holes in this. And again, it's a throwaway remark at the bottom of the slide there, but maybe it's time we just all Foucault then. No, something else that occurred to me is that one thing that has helped me to understand the 17th century paranormal experiences that I've read about off and on for a number of years now is that Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, who I don't want to get into to any great extent, but a concept that he put forward in the 1960s, the episteme. Effectively, he's trying to come up with one word that describes the way that a certain cultural framework influences our understanding, and that it works most effectively because it's something that's widely accepted to the point where it's unquestioned. So if you were to think about that in paranormal action, for example, again, I'll go to ufology on this one briefly, but I've made a point in earlier talks to ASSAP and other people that if you look at certain experiences of people who encountered nature spirits centuries ago and certain experiences of people who claim UFO abductions these days, what is unusual is the amount of overlap in terms of these sincerely recounted experiences. For example, if people attempt to take some object from the fairy or the UFO realm back to the realm that we all inhabit to prove that their experience was genuine, there is a habit of those objects either turning to nothing, being taken from them at the last minute. So in the case of the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction, Betty Hill attempted to take a clock, I mean, as in what we would recognize as a clock from a UFO, and was stopped from doing it. There's a guy called Joe Simonton who met aliens in the early 1960s and was handed a pancake, and it was analyzed subsequently, and it was a pancake, as in an earthly pancake, but he presented this thing as if it being cooked aboard a UFO. So I would simply say that Foucault's epistemes, the notion basically that there are certain things that we just take almost as innate truths. In the 17th century, the experience of God is central to a lot of these writers who are trying to also locate themselves in society and trying to justify their own lives. God isn't questioned. That's part of the episteme at the time. It's part of how all experiences are interpreted. The same experiences in the current era are often interpreted in much more secular ways. So hauntology is an attempt, if you like, to give us that same experience for people who would not accept the existence of God, but they don't question their experience, their uncanny, enigmatic experience of the hauntological works, like the works of the Ghost Box record label. Okay, we've done the hard bit. So basically, thank you for listening so far. I'm not completely finished, but almost there. Shameless self-promotion time. Those are the most recent two books that are of any kind of relevance whatsoever to ASSAP. I will be doing something probably shorter and a bit funnier on the opening half hour of the Seriously Strange weekend. And yeah, I'm bookable if you're remotely in the area. If you were interested in this to the point of thinking, well, actually there's bits of that I didn't know, where do I start? I would make a recommendation that the 5 people here will take you in different directions. Arise Evans, very little known about him. I talked about him way earlier, but an echo, his book is, you can find it online, you can download it. Like most 17th century self-referential stuff, it's not the easiest read, but on the other hand, it's not exactly an epic either. And certainly unlikely to be similar to anything else you're reading at the moment. Similarly, Agnes Beaumont, a very, very interesting life. And whilst her autobiography is not that rich in her encounters with the devil, to a certain extent, the point of her collision with John Bunyan and her falling out with her dad and the devil tormenting her around that time is central to pretty much everything that happens after that. And obvious point, but you might miss it if I don't say it. You don't find very many female perspectives in this. Autobiographers writing in and around the 17th century were almost exclusively successful men. So amongst other things, Agnes Beaumont is a different view on that. John Gerard was a herbalist. You wouldn't describe him as a mystic, but in that sense, then the visionary experiences in his writing are all the more convincing because they're not presented as mystical. The his herbalism and the visions that he have exist very happily side by side. A completely different take. William Weston, who was a Jesuit but also was an exorcist, has quite a lot of, again, if you think about the episteme of the time, quite a lot of people accepted the existence of demons as creatures that you might encounter. I mean, obviously Matthew Hopkins would sooner keep walking the witches than let a demon-haunted mouse get into the room and terrify the hard-working drudges that were helping him out to get these witches hung. Well, William Weston encountered demons because he was an exorcist, and he has quite a lot to say about them, unapologetically. And then, whilst he's not got the most to say about the paranormal, William Cowper or Cooper, different spellings, it's the same guy. The last days of William Cowper were, to say the least, interesting. I'll cut to the chase on this one. He was playing golf, at which point he had a vision about his impending death. He went home, laid down, and died a few days later. Now, a psychological interpretation thereof might see the whole thing in a very secular way, but on the other hand, it's a hell of a story. And it's a completely different and good yardstick story to some of the. I mean, in other words, he's a mainstream religious experiencer for the most of his life, because apart from anything else, he climbs the ranks to be a bishop. With all due respects to Arise Evans, he would have been a disaster even as your parish vicar. So these are all very, very different takes on it. And if you were that bothered, starting with any one of those, if you're unfamiliar with them, would teach you more than I've managed to fit in tonight. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Neil. Hi, it's Claire here. Thank you for a very entertaining talk. You did say at the start of the talk, and actually you mentioned it during the middle as well, that you felt like you'd come into this a bit late. And when you discussed it with Dave and CJ, you realize that their knowledge on the topic is very, very good as well. So it didn't sound like you came into it late at all, not to me anyway.
Well, let me put some context on that. I'm not a trained theologian. I'm very interested in religion, and I've spent a lot of time researching and reading about religion, because a little bit like if Tom Wolfe, if trying to prove Tom Wolfe wrong led me to discover that the 17th century in England actually bore a lot of similarities to the 1960s in the United States, well, in a similar way, I came to the conclusion quite early on that one reason that so many people have such intense UFO experiences is that it's serving a religious need. So I don't have Dave and Chris and CJ's, I don't have a qualification in theology, and I don't have their detailed background on literally who belonged to which sect.
Yeah, I understand that, but the passion and the enthusiasm and the knowledge you have, it shone through, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, my degree is that.